Yeah, I mean, just to add on to what you were saying, I came across this model of consultative democracy, a couple examples pretty recently. One is the other day I read in like one of the Chinese news sources, China Daily, I think, and we're actually featuring it as a headline. But the government is trying to revise data privacy laws. And they wanted to get, people's opinions about this draft regulation. And so they opened it up for public consultation, so that people can go online and kind of give their input on, this draft resolution. And then another thing that I came across recently was, as you probably know, the CPC just recently approved suggestions for its new 5-year plan, the 15th 5-year plan. And in order to get, suggestions for this, they, I think they opened up, they did a similar thing. They opened up consultations online so that regular citizens could give their input on what could be prioritized in the next 5-year plan. And I think that's really astounding to me as someone who comes from the US, because we have never, as US citizens, been asked to give our input on draft legislation. There's some really unpopular laws and budget cuts that are being pushed through Congress, where a lot of working people are losing access to healthcare, they're losing access to SNAP, and none of us were ever consulted on these new budget cuts and these new laws. So, I mean, to me, that was just really, really astounding.
Well, in the US, you don't even have a 5-year plan. You guys barely have a 1-year plan.
Yes, exactly.
Now, oftentimes it looks like you have a 2-week plan. It's quite. I'm trying to find the numbers now, but I was reading about this in the very first weeks after the consultations for the 15th 5-year plan were opened. So this is a very broad set of policies that will determine the direction of Chinese development between 2026 and 2030. Very, I think, critical period in the country's history. As you kind of you've many of the problems of poverty have in a way been solved, and now there's a level of ambition that's being pursued about development and shifting people to this standard of moderate prosperity, about building the first stages of an actual socialist society, which again has a deadline and a timeline in China. This is a very important period, and as you say, it's remarkable that people are asked for their views and their opinion. And in the first, I think, few days, and I might be getting this wrong because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the government had received about 3 million suggestions from the public.
That's the figure that I've read too. Yeah, 3 million.
And that was 3 times more than it received in the same period for the 14th 5-year plan in 2020. And so you have not only this pretty spectacular process of consultation, but you also see that it's improving and expanding with time. And I think that tendency of increasing participation, of, in fact, preparing greater and greater numbers of people for the task of governing, which I think is the fundamental role of a communist party over the long arc of history. You see that tendency in motion as more and more people vote every election cycle, as more and more people engage in these consultative processes, and as more and more people express confidence in the integrity of the democratic system in the country.
Yeah, I really appreciate this quote from Xi Jinping, which I believe is also in the report. It says, if the people are awakened only at voting time and dormant afterward, if the people hear big slogans during elections but have no say after, if the people are favored during canvassing but are left out after elections, this is not true democracy. Which is all to say that China's whole consultative democracy, it integrates feedback from the people, and it's judged by the material improvement in people's lives. It's a results-based governing system, in contrast to the West, where we keep having elections, but we don't really have anything to show for it, when in fact our conditions are actually getting worse. We aren't able to afford anything, rents getting astronomically high. But yeah, like a common argument that I have seen from China critics is that, Xi Jinping was not elected by the people, therefore it's not a democracy. But can you talk a little bit about the electoral part of a whole process, people's democracy, and how elections work in China?
Yeah, so it's a slightly complicated system, I think, partly because of how decentralized the country is and how big it is. And it's really important to emphasize that, and many people don't understand this, but China is among the most decentralized, probably among the most decentralized countries in the world, and certainly more decentralized in its governing model than I think any Western country. In China, local governments, and that includes provincial, county, township, and village levels, and I'll talk a little bit more about the different levels of governance in a moment, they make up 50% of government revenue, and they account for about 85% of expenditure. Now, the global average for central governments is 66% in terms of the percentage of expenditures where they sit in the kind of hierarchy of the state. In China, it's 15%. So the central government in China is responsible for 15% of total government expenditure, which means that a tremendous amount of power is devolved to these local levels, which is where elections happen, right? So you have in China a system where you have what are known as the county and township levels. And at the county and township levels, you have deputies who are elected directly by voters. So again, as I said, if you're in a village of 3,000 people, you are voting for an exemplary neighbor, someone who went above and beyond, someone who went through the same hardships that you went through. We were able to meet these people on our last visit, which is also quite beautiful to see how powerful and effective these bonds are between local community leaders and the communities they are tasked with serving. And again, important to emphasize that it is their responsibility to serve the people. There's a very clear, very specific mandate with very clear performance indicators. And if you don't meet those performance indicators, you can get voted out. So you have deputies who are elected by voters at the county and township levels. Then those deputies elect deputies at the city level. Then the city level deputies elect deputies at the provincial level. And then the provincial level deputies elect deputies to the national level, to the highest level of government. Those are the four levels. And again, the elections, they happen at the lowest level. And by the number of voters, they represent the largest democratic exercise anywhere in the world. In the last election, over 1 billion people took part. Very high levels of participation. I think turnout rates of about 90%. Again, far higher than the turnout in any Western democracy right now, where in fact the tendency has been for dropping turnouts during national elections. The recent election in China was larger than I think any electoral exercise anywhere else, including India, which claims to be the world's largest democracy.
Well, another popular myth about China is that it's a one-party state ruled by the CPC and that there are no other political parties. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, there are actually other political parties. So could you talk a little bit about, the role that they serve in governing and, why do they, how do they relate to the CPC?
So maybe I'll take a step back a little bit because I think in China, what's often emphasized is, in a sense, the historical necessity of the CPC and the historical necessity of this particular governance model, given the weight of China's historical inheritance, given the crises that plagued the country before the revolution. And one of those big challenges was just the lack of a stable political system that could guarantee not even any kind of progressive outcomes for the Chinese people, but that could, survive. You had this really tumultuous period where there was an attempt to introduce liberal democracy at the start of the 20th century. You had very quickly, this is the first decade of the 20th century, you had about 300 political parties that were formed. And in the I think 2 decades that followed, you had 10 different heads of state, you had 45 cabinets, you had 59 prime ministers, basically, almost 2 decades of complete chaos. Now, when I read these figures, I'm reminded of other countries now, the United Kingdom among them, where you also have a very high number of governments and prime ministers in the past few years. But this was a deeply chaotic process that eventually yielded to one-party dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek, which was a period that delivered, war, ultimately a war that they lost, and a cataclysmic economic crisis that was really devastating for the country. And so when the CPC came to power, the system that was created, the system that emerged, was one that sought to develop not a competitive relationship between political parties, but a cooperative one. And so in the period, in the revolutionary period, in the kind of decades around before and during the revolution, you had a number of parties that emerged, which continue to exist. They're known as the 8 democratic parties. They're much smaller than the Communist Party of China, but their function isn't to compete against the Communist Party, but to operate as a vehicle for different segments of society to also have a hearing in the political process. So they're basically channels for different groups within society to participate in governance. For example, in the processes of consultation that I described, in carrying out research for certain policy areas, and providing these alternative voices in the political process. And all of those parties have representation at the different levels of governance that we talked about.
I guess one question before I let you go, how would you respond to people who may take a look, like people in the West who may take a look at China's system and say that, no, China is not socialist. It's made too many concessions to capital. Having written this report and you having been to China and actually talked to some people in these villages, how would you respond to that, very common critique?
Yeah, one of the big challenges, I think, for people in the West, and I often say to Chinese friends and colleagues that it's impossible to overstate the extent to which people in the West really know nothing about China. Very, very basic understanding of the political process. But it's also quite difficult given the lack of published data published information, published writing on these things in the West in English. Until really a couple of years ago, things have gotten a lot better, but it remains difficult to get details on some of the kind of finer points of Chinese policymaking. One of the things that really struck me beyond the case study that I already mentioned was on this last trip that I went on. We visited 5 villages in Henan province that had also until very recently been relatively poor, some more than others. In fact, one of the villages had basically no functioning electricity until the 2000s, and had no paved roads and, of course, no internet, no telephone connectivity. Now, that particular village was as developed as any I had seen in the wealthiest parts of Western Europe. Really remarkable transformation. But what struck me was that the way those transformations happened, and the way those transformations happened, guaranteed that those changes and those improvements in people's lives are not the result of, state handouts, but they're sustainable and they're kind of self-reproducing. And so in this one particular village, what the party helped the local community to do is to set up a village cooperative where every resident of the village has one share in the cooperative. The cooperative then set up 3 businesses to deal with different things that are done in the village. One dealt with a particular kind of production that, for export. Another dealt with developing the local tourism industry by building hotels. And another one dealt with managing the village infrastructure. Then you had the Communist Party at the township level, which effectively recruited a capitalist branding company to help the local community, make nice packaging and nice advertisements for their local goods. For example, I don't know, they had these fermented duck eggs and nice teas, and they had, they had peach compotes, that kind of stuff that they produced in the village. And they recruited this company under the condition that the company would work directly in the village and would train the village community in the kinds of roles that were available, that were needed there. And so you effectively have a situation where a community of people who are subsistence farmers, and still to some extent are now shareholders in 3 corporations that they democratically manage, have access to a more or less corporate job without having to leave their village, which is reasonably well paid, and have the support of private capital, which is directed by the party to serve their interests and not the other way around. And so I think one of the things that is most important is that it's very clear to me that however many millionaires and billionaires there might be in China, as a result of the reform and opening up process, capital does not hold the reins of political processes. Capital is subordinated to political processes, and those political processes are structured to improve the living conditions of the vast majority of the Chinese people. And that is the fundamental difference, again, in the nature of, or the structure of class within the state, right? None of this would be possible in a capitalist society whose very function, or in a capitalist state whose very function is to siphon wealth from those who produce it, from the workers, upwards to the owners of capital and ultimately the bankers and financiers.
Well, Pavel Vargin, thank you so much for joining us on the China Report. I really encourage all our viewers to go read your and Jason's report. I think you can find it on the Progressive International website, and we'll also link it in the show description. Before you go, where can people find your work if they're interested in your writing?
My work is all over the place, but if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you may. X, formerly known as Twitter, although do you still call it Twitter?
I still call it Twitter. I never call it X.
Great. I mean, we have to, any and every form of resistance against the tech oligarchy is I think, noble and good. So let's call it Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. I also reluctantly set up a Substack, but I almost never write there. So I think Twitter is the safest bet.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Pavel. You should come back again sometime soon. We'd love to have you.
Would love to. Great pleasure to be on. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌帮助了睡眠品质。有季节敏感、代谢困扰、关心异常细胞风险的好朋友呢，可以选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌。它添加有超级食物羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。 太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便。要吃就吃最好的。